This is Canonical, and this week we are talking about Sag Harbor by Colson Whitehead. In our last episode, we reviewed the book, and in this episode, we'll just have an in-depth discussion. I'm James Shao, and I'm joined by Iad Darris.
Hello.
And Sam Spieler.
Hello.
As always. So let's start with you, Sam. Why don't you start our discussion off this week?
Sure. This book is semi-autobiographical, as we discussed in the review portion. This book features Black characters we, or I, don't often see represented in popular media, namely Black prep school children of a family that's wealthy enough to own summer houses in the Hamptons. In our review episode, we discussed the perceived plotlessness of the book, calling Whitehead's own recognition that this is not a book about KKK or other overt forms of racism and their impact on a Black teen or his family. The need or expectation for a novel written by a Black person to be filled with such accounts makes me suspect that in itself is a subtle form of racism, that expectation. In fact, early in the book, when Ben describes how he and Reggie were growing apart, with Reggie more quickly picking up certain hobbies or enjoyments, like the careful care of his sneakers and the love of the budding hip-hop genre. I had this really closely felt internal fear that we were being prepared for something awful to happen to Reggie specifically, with Ben as a witness. And I'm concerned about what that might say about how we, or I, approach novels that both are and are not about race like this. That without knowing what the book was about beyond a Black family in the Hamptons, I assumed the plot was going to lean toward violence. Was that at play for either of you?
I think that there is an expectation, especially nowadays, to read about Black youth and especially young Black men and to automatically assume the worst and automatically assume that it's going to be a violent confrontation of some sort. I don't know if it's necessarily racism on part of the reader for having that expectation, but just the overall climate where Black narratives are kind pigeonholed into that type of fiction.
So, Sam, do you think this is related to this idea of the double consciousness that Du Bois brought up before? And Du Bois also, I think, referenced in the book. You know, the idea that minorities, but African Americans specifically in his case, have this kind of double consciousness.
I can see that. Yeah. It's not something that's obvious to the white reader or the white person, generally speaking. But yeah, that's definitely at play here. We see it in the book quite a bit. There's this push to be hard. There's this push to be tough teens growing up into men. But that's countered by them still being boys, and specifically Ben being a very nerdy teen that doesn't have to deal with the more violent things all the time.
So, Sam, are you saying that this is a problem for the reader to expect this, or is this a problem with writers who always present this sort of image of Black adolescence?
A little of both, I think. I don't think Whitehead is at fault here at all. I approached it worried that I was bringing that into it, but there's definitely a culture of expectation. I see a lot of Black writers and other Black people in the media talking about how we need to change how society sees these people, even with the protests going on. People talking about we can't keep showing just these gruesome deaths because then that just perpetuates the idea of violence.
As a counterpoint, I did not have that fear going in, Sam. I don't know about you yet, but when I was reading that part, I didn't think anything bad was going to happen to Reggie.
So maybe it's me.
I didn't feel it in that specific moment, but I agree with Sam that there was this undercurrent of fear in the novel, like, oh man, these kids are just having too good of a time. Something bad is going to happen to them.
I mentioned Barry David and the dad drinking. We talked a little bit about the implied violence that never happened on page. But Colson definitely flirts with that idea quite a bit, even though it's never fully realized. Barry David was the character at the end that everyone thinks is a cousin to someone else, and he's the one that's bringing the kind of riotous behavior. He's destroying people's property just to see it burn.
Well, let's talk more about him, because I don't really know how I feel about that. How does his presence in the novel complicate the racial politics of the novel?
The way I saw it was, while he is just another teen, there's this tension between he's one of us, but he's also not one of us. And is it our responsibility to stop him? Or is it just another teen being another teen and it's not a bad thing? The tension for me was either something's going to happen now, or because he's not being stopped, that's fostering some kind of behavior for the future. But again, I wondered if I was reading too much into that.
Yeah, I mean, I did definitely feel more on edge when I was reading the passages at the end of the novel where he was throwing patio furniture into the bonfire. He was definitely a destructive force in a world of peace. And I saw him as not necessarily belonging to the same class of people in the novel. And I think that there is a definite intersection in the novel between race and class, where these people are all black people, but don't forget, they're all very wealthy black people. They belong to a certain social class, and that guides their behavior very strongly.
Well, not just that. It's wealthy black families that have history in Sag Harbor.
Yes.
So a lot of them have known each other for generations.
I think it's quite telling. They have that one scene where he gets the furniture from, I think it's the Mitchells, and you can see the grown-ups inside dancing, drinking their cocktails, and it's a pretty stark contrast to the bonfire, but more specifically this act of destruction. It's a very stark juxtaposition.
If I were to go out on a limb here, we could almost say that this scene is showing the success of the upwardly mobile black community being undermined by the violence of other black people. I don't necessarily want to say that's what Colson Whitehead has in mind, but it's a possible reading, because I do think that there is a fragility that a lot of upper-class black people have, where they want to elevate their lives as black people, and they don't want to be bound to this kind of hood image or this kind of image of drug dealing and ghetto life that is so common in most mainstream depictions of black culture.
Well, that's what his father says, right? He calls them the street N-word.
Yeah, his father definitely is the figure in the novel that evidences that class paranoia, that anxiety about elevating him and his family from this other aspect of the black community.
Yeah, and what makes it interesting to me is because he's not of that class originally. He's nouveau riche. He worked his way up, which is probably why he's so paranoid about it. Whereas his mother, who does come from old Sag Harbor and old money in a way, she's a little bit more relaxed, or she doesn't even come up in that kind of conversation.
Well, this actually brings to mind the character of Benji himself and the fine line that he's walking in this novel. I see him as caught not between two sides, but between three different things. First of all, you have his inclinations towards rock music, D&D, and other quote-unquote white cultural elements. He doesn't just like rock music, but he likes like the Smiths and Susie and the Banshees. He likes like explicitly white music. And then there's also, on the other hand, the performance of blackness in front of his friends, where he is being himself, but he's performing to a certain degree, because even compared to his brother, he's not the quote-unquote blackest kid on the block. And then you have another version of black manhood that comes from his father. I saw this especially significantly internalized in the scene where he's talking about whether or not it's okay to shoplift. And he has this internalized Sidney Poitier voice. And the voice says to him, "Because they think we steal, we mustn't steal."
Is that your Poitier voice?
That's as good as I can. I don't think anybody can really do a Sidney Poitier voice, but That to me, it's just like they call it respectability politics that I think is very out of fashion right now. But I'm having trouble with this novel only because I can't get away from the fact that I think that that's the kind of politics that Colson is trying to deal in. He's kind of saying to people, Black people should be behaving differently than they are.
Yeah, this was written as part of the post-black idea. It was 2009 when Obama had been elected already, and parts of America took that as meaning, okay, we're past a lot of the race issues. Now we can evaluate Black people as people rather than as Black people specifically, on merit rather than on skin color. But there is that tension now because it's very clear that we're not in that era. We're still struggling with the same issues that we've always been dealing with.
I think even more than that, it's not just about how people think about Black people, but how Black people present themselves and the type of culture that they're willing to engage in. This is something I brought up in the last episode when I was talking about how Benji and by extension Colson Whitehead seem to have a preference towards Run DMC and the kind of good time party jams rather than the confrontational sort of message that we find in NWA. It seems like Colson Whitehead or Benji have a problem with the way that Black people are acting or the way that Black culture is manifest in its media.
That is, to me, speaking as a non-Black person, so obviously a big caveat here, but I think that's a big tension throughout Black culture. And not just starting at this time, but like throughout Black culture since the beginning of Black people being in the US or being on this land, right? This question of how you're supposed to act. Is there an acceptable way of acting or not? I mean, it's a hugely loaded question. I don't know how this book is positioned in that conversation, actually. You're saying that it seems like it's saying this, and I want to agree with you, but I just don't see enough evidence to say it.
Well, the tension I see between kind of a wholesale adoption of this kind of what I had mentioned earlier is they call it respectability politics. The idea that if you want to be respected as a group, you have to behave in a respectable way. And if you are mistreated as a group, you can't just look to the other to justify why you've been mistreated. You have to look to yourself and to say, well, are we worthy of being respected? That's the idea that we find. Probably the most famous recent example is in 2004, celebrity rapist Bill Cosby gave a speech to the NAACP. He called it the Pound Cake speech, was talking basically about how the Black community was being set back by a lack of parenting and a lack of proper behavior among Black people.
Yeah.
It's very ironic nowadays to think of Bill Cosby giving that message to the Black community, but there it is nonetheless. And basically at the time he was celebrated, but nowadays I think that the overall social consensus among people who care about social justice is that respectability politics are bullshit, and basically Black behavior doesn't justify white violence or white racism. Anyways, to get back to the novel, the counterpoint that I see to this idea that Whitehead supports this respectability politics is in his father, because his father is not presented in a sympathetic light. I see his father as being as close to a villain as you're going to find in this novel, and he very much is an example of respectability politics, and he is not somebody that the reader is inclined to sympathize with.
On this idea of post-blackness, do you think that post-blackness is kind of a moot point now that we are post-Obama?
I don't know if it's a moot point. It's something that's interesting to discuss. It certainly isn't as relevant as we thought it was, or as we thought it would be. I don't think it's completely moot. I think it's something, to Ehad's point of respectability politics, I would be wary of saying it's something to have as a goal, because that does call into question how should Black people act. But it would be nice if we could judge people based on merit and not on skin color. But yeah, we're not there.
First of all, the idea of post-blackness carries within it the idea that there's something wrong with current Blackness. which I think is a very, very difficult idea to gain traction. I also think that post-blackness can work if we don't conflate it with assimilation. And I think the problem with assimilation is that we see, especially in the novel with Benji's father, he's not post-black in the sense that he's wealthy, but he's post-black in the sense that he has assimilated the masculine problems of the white man in the way that he treats his wife and the very violent nature of his alcoholism. That, to me, I think is the problem with post-blackness, is that it's very often, well, you don't have to perform blackness in the way that other people do. You can act like white people if you want to. And I think that that shouldn't be the goal. I think the goal for everybody is for them to act in a more sincere or natural way and not feel like they have to act more like the dominant group in order to gain respectability.
So, because we're talking about this yet, how would you define post-blackness? Because I actually found it very difficult to understand it in its entirety. I mean, it's a very complicated term and it's a very complicated issue. Like, how do you understand this idea of post-blackness? Because it's different from post-racial, for sure.
I mean, that is a tough thing to nail down. For me, I did see it as similar to post-racial, but I definitely didn't see it the way you had brought it up. The idea that by being post-black, that means now you're free to act like white people. I didn't see it as that, but more that there's this image of, kind of as you put it, black now or black past, rather that there's this image that there is all of blackness is one thing, and it isn't. And by being post-black, we can move away from that and more onto the individual and get away from this all blackness represented by each individual on their own.
Maybe I can present a sort of definition, and I don't think this is the only definition, but it's something that I actually did bring up off air earlier. So it comes from the culture critic Touré, and I don't know much about him, and I think that there are people who might feel upset with my use of the word critic because they think of him as something less than a critic, like more of a TV personality. But he describes it as the liberating value in tossing off the immense burden of race-wide representation and the idea that everything they do must speak to or for or about the entire race. And he gives an example in his book, which is, I think he calls it the watermelon question. And what he says is, would you, as a black person, eat a watermelon in public? Because that act is so racially charged, and he's saying, why not? Even though it's an act that carries with it history and possible discrimination, there's nothing stopping you from eating that watermelon. So that's kind of how I understand post-blackness. It's that shedding of all that, I would say, baggage that comes from, and mostly negative baggage, I'd say, that comes from being black. He's saying that you should shed all that baggage and live your life. And it doesn't matter if it's white, black, whatever. You should just live your life. And he's not arguing for a post-racial world where there is no race. He's saying there are distinctions between people and cultures. That's obvious. But he's more specifically talking about shedding that baggage. That's how I understand it.
Yeah, that's kind of a better put way of what I was trying to say.
I think it's definitely more to do with the individual and how he chooses to act versus the reception of other people. I think, to me, it's more to do with constraint and feeling like you don't need to be bound by your race or any other category. We see this in the novel, especially with Benji, where he likes the Smiths and he likes Susie and the Banshees. And there is the point in the novel where they're talking about Planet Rock, and he says, well, actually, that part of the song was lifted from a Kraftwerk song. And the other two kids he's talking to are very critical of him. They say, no, they didn't steal that from anybody. And it's just like this idea that you can be black, but you can also like European music, and you can be black and you can also like Dungeons and Dragons. When I was talking earlier, a few times I used this term performing blackness. I think that everything that we do is more or less performative, but specifically when we talk about blackness as a racial category, because there is a pressure, I think, on black people to behave in a certain way, to manifest their race in a way that is understandable to other people. And I think that somebody like Touré is probably saying, you don't need to behave in that way just because that's the way that Black people typically behave. You should feel less constrained and more like yourself.
And I think he's also very much against what he terms, and I don't think it's only his term, but racial policing, which is that you should act in a certain way. Because if you don't act in a certain way, then you're letting everyone else down. Chappelle has that famous bit, right? That all the white supremacists and edgy teens started using the difference between the A and the hard R. Oh, no, that's Chris Rock. The difference between the A and the hard R and the two types of people. That's the kind of race policing or racial policing that Touré is arguing against. But people very much push back against this. There are a lot of people who disagree with him vehemently that this is, some people would say that this is desirable, that you should have this kind of policing because we are not out of the woods, is what they would say, probably.
I think that all of this conversation is born out of a specific historical moment that doesn't exist anymore. That to me is why I would say that the novel is somewhat dated, just in the sense that it feels very much at home with the 2009 birth of the Obama presidency, where as a nation we were all very hopeful and we all thought that some of the problems, at least from our past, were behind us. And now it's very clear that that's not the case at all. And I couldn't shake that feeling when I was reading this novel, that it's very much of a period that doesn't exist anymore.
So a lot of reviewers call this a bildungsroman or a coming-of-age novel or a story of change. Do you actually think it's a bildungsroman? Because there is a critic, his name is, I think, Marlon Lieber. I believe he's German. And he argues that it's a novel of manners instead. So it's a novel of manners is a novel that explores the degree to which people measure up to society's expectations. It was more popular during the Victorian era with Jane Austen. It's not as popular nowadays, but he makes an argument that this is in fact a novel of manners and not really a Bildungsroman because Benji doesn't really change from the beginning to the end. And instead, really the central theme of the novel is about fitting in. Do you find that to be true? Do you think this is more of a novel of manners than it is a Bildungsroman?
It's definitely not a Bildungsroman because he doesn't change. I agree. It's more of a snapshot than a motion picture, if you get my meaning.
He doesn't change in a big, significant way, but there are different things of his consciousness that he's trying to shape. He's trying to transition from a boy to a man. And even though maybe that isn't a big outward change, he's working at it. He's trying. So I feel like it's somewhere in between Bildungsroman and novel of manners.
Yeah, I don't know though, Sam, because he had the motivation at the beginning of the novel and it wasn't satisfied. And then he had the motivation at the end of the novel and it wasn't satisfied. So he wanted throughout the course to become something different, but he never really managed it. He just kind of had a plan for, well, I'm going to start talking to more girls and I'm going to start doing this and I'm going to start doing that, but he doesn't really do anything or change anything internally. He just has this desire, this frustrated desire.
I guess I feel similarly in that I don't really see it as a Bildungsroman. I think that, for example, he wants people to call him Ben, and people don't. That's not what a Bildungsroman is, but it's like he wants to change, but by the end of the summer, you get the sense that really not much has changed, and there's kind of a reset that happens, and he ends up continuing being the same person.
What do you think about how we perceive that versus how he perceives that? Because at the end, there's that epilogue where it sounded to me like he thought major things had happened, even though to us, the reader, they hadn't.
I'm pulling up the last page here, Sam, and I actually have an opposite reading to you. He's talking about his plans, and he says he's going to start seeing some concerts, go to more parties. That was the key. It says, lay off the cokes. I could do it. It was going to be a great year. I was sure of it. Isn't it funny, the way the mind works? Those last two sentences seem to call into question his entire planning of the year. He's saying, as an adult looking back, isn't it funny that we make these plans, that we continue to do so, even though we had this summer to look back on and nothing changed, really? So I had a a different reading.
I agree, but he's talking about the future year. He's talking about what he's going to do. And I got the sense that even though not a lot happened to him as a person or to his character in terms of change, the things that happen in this novel, the things that happened over this summer in 1985, I took it as these are things that had not happened to him before in previous summers.
That is true. Earlier on the page, yeah, he says, I kissed Melanie Downey and touched her tit, not under her shirt, but still, I was definitely more together than I was at the start of the summer. There is a sense that things are changing, but I think that there's some implied humor in that ending that I think that you're missing. And the humor is that, well, he thinks these substantial things have happened. The truth of the matter is that very little has happened. I think that the ridiculousness of the situation is how teenagers think that their world is so meaningful and important. And for adults, especially adults looking back on it, in fact, the teenage world matters very little. And I think that's the humor of the scene, is that he thinks that monumental things have happened when in fact these things that have happened are actually very unimportant.
I acknowledge that. That's why I put this somewhere in between those two, between Novel of Manners and Bildungsroman. It's not a classic Bildungsroman.
Do you guys think it's a novel of manners?
At the parts that were most interesting to me, yes, but I think that for other people, probably less so.
How do you mean? Why other people less so?
Well, like I mentioned earlier, there's a tension between Benji and his friends and his father, and they all have different ways of quote-unquote performing blackness. And the tension for me is Benji trying to figure out how he should act. That to me was what makes it part of this novel of manners tradition. But that to me, I think, is not something that other readers would focus on as much. I think other readers would probably focus more on the humor or the pop cultural references or the nostalgia rather than that aspect.
I guess so, but I think if you take those bits out, you aren't left with very much. I feel like that's, without trying to put too many words in Whitehead's mouth or on his page, that's part of what he was going for, I think, that we do have this summer of nothing happening, but hidden within that are these tensions. I think without those tensions, without the reader acknowledging those tensions, this book doesn't have a whole lot.
But there are big sections of the novel that aren't really as tense, like when they're talking about going to the Lisa Lisa concert or they're talking about scooping ice cream. That to me is more just like teenage slice of life sort of stuff. And that to me is maybe 70% of the novel. It's all very enjoyable. I didn't mind reading it, but it wasn't as interesting to me as the other parts of the novel where you have a more direct confrontation between his father, himself, and his friends. That to me was the interesting 30%.
That was the Wonder Years / Happy Days that I referenced earlier. The fun hijinks you get up to as a teen, where you can accidentally touch your coworker's boob.
Part of what I did really enjoy about this is that even though it is that 70-30, the fact that there is a 70-30 is indicative of the kind of life, that double consciousness that so many Black people have to live.
All right, well, let's take a break from this heavy topic. And when we come back, we'll look forward to applying some of these ideas to perhaps other books that we'll read in this series. We'll be right back. Okay, we're back. So we talked about quite a few ideas earlier. Which of these ideas do you think we'll return to going forward with our next two novels? We have coming up Tommy Orange's There, There, and Britt Bennett's The Vanishing Half.
I think identity is going to be really important in all three of these books. So because of that, I think double consciousness is going to play a big role.
I think that the issues that we found in Sag Harbor are somewhat applicable to other minority fiction texts that we might look at. But I think that this book was especially interesting because it addressed the intersection of race and class in an interesting way, just because we're not usually talking about upper class professional black people, and we're not usually talking about minorities and their lived experience when they come from that place of privilege. It's usually a place of suffering or a place of difficulty rather than privilege.
One thing I'm looking forward to is because Britt Bennett's book is so current, I wonder if it is definitely not about post-blackness. That's what I'm looking forward to, because we all kind of posited that perhaps this book is dated, that it was very much a product of those 8 years during the Obama administration. So that's actually a question I have in my mind, whether we even return to this question of post-blackness or not.
My guess is no.
I think that's a fair guess.
All right, then. We'll return next week with our review of There by Tommy Orange. Thank you for listening. If you want to get updates on our next episodes, you can find us on social media at Canonical Pod. We also have a subreddit for discussion on Reddit at r/Canonical Pod. You can just search for Canonical Pod Reddit and you'll find us. We'd love to hear from you, and we'd love for you to join our discussion. We'll have show notes, and we'll also have links to all of the articles and all of the reading that we referenced earlier. So next week, we'll be back with Tommy Orange. If you want to support us, you can use our affiliate link. Till next time, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.